What if Enoch, the man who walked with God, wrote something so dangerous he begged for it to be hidden? Not the Watchers, not the Nephilim. Something worse, a text about giants so cursed even heaven wanted it buried. Somewhere in the caves near the Dead Sea, buried under centuries of dust and silence, fragments of a text surfaced that even the most devoted scribes of ancient Israel refused to fully copy. They called it the Book of Giants. And unlike the stories we grew up with in Sunday school, this was not a fairy tale about big men walking the earth. This was a warning, a record, something so unsettling that entire religious councils spent generations trying to erase it from memory. To understand why this book terrified people who otherwise feared nothing but God himself, you have to go back to a verse most churches read quickly and move past without asking the obvious question. Genesis 6:4 says, "There were giants in the earth in those days." Just like that, no explanation, no context, as if the writer assumed you already knew who these beings were and simply didn't want to dwell on it. But the Book of Giants dwells on it. It fills in the silence that Genesis leaves behind, and what it reveals is not comforting. Think about how strange that verse actually is once you slow down and read it the way it was meant to be read. A single line tucked between the fall of man and the coming of the flood, casually mentioning that giants existed as though it were common knowledge, requiring no further comment. Ancient readers wouldn't have needed more, because the fuller account was already circulating among them, passed down through oral tradition and preserved in writings like the one we're discussing now. Later generations, removed from that context by centuries and translation, are left staring at a single verse wondering what it's hiding. According to the fragments recovered from Qumran, these giants were not simply tall humans. They were the offspring of the Watchers, angelic beings who descended to Mount Hermon and broke the boundary between heaven and earth. Their children, born of angel and human, grew at an unnatural rate. Some accounts describe them consuming everything around them, turning on animals, then on each other, then on the very humans who bore them. This wasn't folklore meant to scare children at night. This was a civilization's memory of something it could not explain through ordinary means. What makes the Book of Giants different from the more familiar Book of Enoch is its tone. Enoch writes like a prophet delivering a vision, structured, deliberate, almost liturgical. The Book of Giants reads more like a fragmented testimony pieced together from dreams, confessions, and desperate pleas. Two of the giants, named in the text as Ohia and Hahia, are shown having visions of their own destruction. They see tablets being washed by water. They see gardens being uprooted, orchards stripped bare, and messengers descending with sealed scrolls that no one on earth is permitted to read. They understand even before the flood arrives that judgment is already written for them. There's something profoundly human in that fear, even coming from beings the text calls monstrous. The giants don't simply accept this fate quietly either. According to the fragments, they send one of their own, a figure named Maweh, to seek out Enoch directly and ask him to interpret their dreams. Enoch's answer is not gentle. He confirms what they already suspected in the pit of their stomachs. Their days are numbered, their strength will not save them, and no bargaining will change what has already been set in motion. It's a rare moment in ancient literature where the monsters of the story are given a voice, and that voice is filled with dread rather than menace. Genesis 6:5 captures the same atmosphere from heaven's side of the equation, describing how every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. A description broad enough to include not just mankind, but the corrupted bloodline mankind had become entangled with. And this is where the story stops being ancient history and starts feeling uncomfortably relevant. If these giants understood their fate before it happened, why does Genesis rush past their existence in a single sentence? Some scholars argue it's because the writers of the canonical Torah wanted to distance Israel's faith from anything that resembled the mythology of surrounding nations. Others believe something more deliberate was happening, that certain truths about the pre-flood world were considered too dangerous, too destabilizing, to remain in circulation. Whichever explanation you lean toward, one thing is clear. The Book of Giants was never meant to be forgotten by accident. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, the same group responsible for preserving Enoch's writings, treated the Book of Giants with a level of caution that goes beyond simple archiving. Fragments were kept separate. Portions were left incomplete, either lost to time or intentionally left unfinished. And when later religious authorities compiled what would become accepted scripture, this book didn't make the cut. Not because it lacked spiritual weight. If anything, it carries the kind of weight that makes people nervous. It forces a question most institutions would rather you not ask. What if the corruption before the flood wasn't just moral decay, but something physical, something that altered the nature of humanity itself? Jude 1:6 offers a small but pointed confirmation buried inside the New Testament, describing angels who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, reserved in judgment for a coming day. It's a verse most readers skim past without realizing it's referencing the exact event the Book of Giants describes in horrifying detail. The New Testament writers knew this tradition. They assumed their audience knew it too. It wasn't fringe knowledge back then. It was common understanding, later buried under centuries of selective memory. What the Book of Giants ultimately gives us is not just a myth about ancient monsters. It's a mirror held up to a world that ignored every warning sign until it was too late. A world so consumed by pride, by power, by the blending of things that were never meant to blend, that God himself chose to start over. And if you've ever felt like the patterns described in that ancient text feel a little too familiar to the world outside your window right now, you're not alone in that feeling. If this is the kind of history that makes you want to look deeper instead of looking away, I put together something you're going to want in your hands. It's called The Forbidden Book of Enoch, a fully illustrated guide that walks through everything the institutional church left out. The Watchers, the Giants, the pre-flood world, laid out in a way that finally makes sense of the fragments most people never get to see in one place. The link is pinned in the first comment below this video, and once you open it, you'll understand why so many people are calling it the missing piece of their faith. Before we go further into what these giants actually knew about their own end, take a second and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more buried in these texts than most people realize, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. Long before the giants themselves became the problem, there was a decision made on a mountain that changed everything. Mount Hermon sits on the border of what is now Syria and Lebanon, and in the Book of Enoch, it's named specifically as the place where 200 watchers descended and bound themselves together with an oath. Not a casual agreement, a mutual pact sealed by all 200 because each one understood what they were about to do would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The text even names their leader, Semjaza, who reportedly hesitated at first, worried he would bear the sin alone if the others backed out. So they swore together, every single one of them, cursing themselves and binding one another to the plan before a single step was taken. That detail matters more than most people realize. This wasn't a single angel falling from grace in a moment of weakness, the way later art and literature would simplify it. This was a coordinated decision made by beings who fully understood the weight of what they were doing and chose to do it anyway, together, as if numbers could somehow dilute the consequence. Deuteronomy 32:8 hints at this same layered structure of the heavens, describing how the Most High divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, a phrase that only makes sense once you understand there was an entire order of beings assigned dominion over the earth, an order that Mount Hermon shattered from within. What the Watchers brought down with them wasn't just physical presence, it was knowledge. Azazel, one of the named leaders alongside Semjaza, is credited in the Book of Enoch with teaching humanity how to forge weapons of war, how to craft metal into swords and shields, and how to adorn themselves with jewelry and cosmetics designed to seduce. Other Watchers taught the secrets of root cutting, the movement of the stars used for divination, and the casting of spells. Enoch's account goes further still, naming specific angels responsible for specific disciplines, as though the text were cataloging a curriculum handed down piece by piece. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. It reads less like a myth and more like an inventory of stolen fire, each watcher responsible for a different flame passed into human hands. This wasn't education in any wholesome sense. It was an acceleration, technology and mysticism handed to a species that wasn't ready for either, dropped into human hands without the wisdom to carry the weight responsibly. Enoch himself describes the earth becoming filled with unrighteousness as a direct result. Violence multiplying not because humanity simply chose evil on its own, but because it had been handed tools and temptations far beyond what its moral development could contain. Genesis 6:11 confirms this same trajectory from the other side of the account, stating plainly that the earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence, a corruption the text ties directly to the period immediately following the Watcher's descent. And this is where the story stops sounding like ancient mythology and starts sounding uncomfortably familiar. Every civilization that archaeologists have unearthed from the deep past carries traces of knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey predates agriculture itself. Massive carved stone pillars arranged with astronomical precision by people who, according to the conventional timeline, hadn't even settled into permanent communities. Baalbek in Lebanon holds stones so massive that modern engineers still debate how they were transported and set into place, let alone why anyone in that era would have needed to build on such an inhuman scale to begin with. Puma Punku in Bolivia shows cuts so precise they look machined rather than carved by hand. Interlocking stones fitted together with a level of tolerance that would challenge even contemporary construction methods. Sacsayhuaman, perched above Cusco in Peru, features boulders weighing well over 100 tons, fitted so tightly that not even a blade of grass can slide between them, a level of craftsmanship that has no clear point of origin in the region's known technological history. None of these sites fit comfortably into the story we're normally told about slow, gradual human progress. The Book of Giants and the broader Enochian tradition offer an explanation that mainstream archaeology tends to avoid entirely, not because the evidence contradicts it, but because the explanation itself sits outside what most institutions are willing to consider. If beings with knowledge beyond human capability descended and began teaching directly, sudden leaps forward wouldn't be mysteries anymore. They'd be exactly what you'd expect. The children born of these unions, the giants themselves, would have grown up surrounded by this accelerated knowledge, inheriting both the physical strength of their fathers and the forbidden understanding those fathers carried down from heaven. Josephus, writing centuries later as a Jewish historian, described these offspring as men of reputation, strong and immense, whose deeds resembled those told by the Greeks concerning their own giants and heroes. He wasn't writing fiction. He was drawing a direct comparison between the biblical account and the myths surrounding figures like the Titans and the sons of the gods, found throughout Greek and Roman tradition, myths that appear almost universally across cultures separated by oceans and centuries with no obvious way to have influenced one another. Sumerian tablets describe the Anunnaki. Hindu texts describe the Rakshasas and other beings of immense stature and power. Even Mesoamerican traditions carry stories of giant beings who once walked the earth before being wiped out by catastrophe. It's difficult to dismiss a pattern that consistent as pure coincidence. What all of this points to is a world far stranger than the sanitized version most of us were taught in Sunday school. A world where the line between heaven and earth wasn't just theological, it was structural, maintained deliberately, and its collapse wasn't an accident. It was a choice made on a mountain, sealed by an oath and carried out by beings who knew exactly what they were risking and did it anyway. Some accounts suggest the Watchers believed they could still make things right, that whatever offspring came from their union with human women would somehow remain under their control, a miscalculation that would prove to be the gravest error in the entire account. The question that leaves us with isn't just why they did it. It's what they were trying to accomplish that made the risk feel worth taking in the first place, and whether that same pattern, knowledge given before humanity was ready to carry it, is something we should be paying closer attention to now. The children born from that union on Mount Hermon didn't grow the way ordinary children grow. According to the fragments preserved at Qumran, the offspring of the Watchers and human women reached full stature within a matter of years, not decades, their bodies expanding at a pace that defied every natural law governing human development. Some accounts describe them reaching heights the text measures in the thousands of cubits, numbers so extreme that most scholars read them as symbolic exaggeration rather than literal measurement, a way of communicating something too vast and wrong to describe in ordinary terms. But strip away the exaggeration and what remains is still deeply unsettling. These were beings that grew too fast, consumed too much, and outpaced the ability of the world around them to sustain their existence. Even their own fathers, the Watchers who had crossed the boundary to create them, seemed unprepared for what their offspring would become, watching helplessly as the children they'd fathered outgrew any capacity for restraint. That last part is where the Book of Giants becomes genuinely disturbing rather than simply mythological. The text describes the giants exhausting the food supply available to them with alarming speed. Once the crops and livestock could no longer keep pace with their appetite, they turned to something far worse. Birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish were consumed indiscriminately, the natural order collapsing under the weight of creatures that were never meant to exist in the first place. Farmland stripped bare within seasons instead of years, entire herds vanishing faster than they could be replenished, a scarcity spiraling outward until desperation became the defining condition of daily existence for everyone within reach of these beings. And when even that wasn't enough, the account grows darker still, describing the giants turning against humanity itself, drinking blood and devouring flesh in a way that mirrors almost exactly the language used centuries later to describe the most extreme forms of moral collapse. Genesis 6:11 uses the word violence to describe the state of the earth at this time, a word that in Hebrew carries connotations of bloodshed, cruelty, and the complete breakdown of any restraint between predator and prey, a description that fits the Book of Giants disturbingly well. What's remarkable is how the text doesn't portray the giants purely as mindless monsters. They dream, they fear, they send messengers seeking answers, as we saw with Maui approaching Enoch directly. There's a tragic dimension to their portrayal that most modern retellings strip away entirely, reducing them to simple movie monsters rather than beings caught in a catastrophe they didn't fully choose for themselves. They were born into a corruption that predated their own existence, inheriting the consequences of a decision made by their fathers on a mountain long before they ever drew breath. That doesn't excuse the violence that followed, but it does complicate the picture in a way that ancient audiences would have understood far better than we do today, familiar as they were with stories of inherited curses and generational consequence. There's also a detail in the fragments that rarely gets discussed outside academic circles, one worth pausing on. Some giants are described weeping in their visions, aware that the floodwaters rising against them were not simply a natural disaster, but a direct response to what their existence represented. That kind of self-awareness, placed inside beings the text elsewhere describes as monstrous, creates a tension that ancient scribes clearly wrestled with as they preserved this account. It suggests the writers weren't interested in simple villains. They were documenting something closer to tragedy, a corruption that consumed even the beings who benefited from it most directly, leaving them no less trapped than the humans caught in the destruction spreading around them. The Book of Jubilees, another text preserved outside the canon yet deeply respected by certain early Jewish communities, adds another layer to this account by describing how the giants began to turn on one another as their situation deteriorated. Brother against brother, tribe against tribe, the same corruption that had been unleashed on the wider world eventually consuming the giants from within their own ranks, until entire clans destroyed each other before the floodwaters ever arrived to finish what they'd started. It's a pattern that echoes throughout Scripture in different forms, corruption that cannot be contained, eventually devouring even the source that created it. Numbers 13:33 later references this same bloodline indirectly, describing the sons of Enoch as descendants of the Nephilim, the very beings this catastrophic union produced, suggesting the line didn't end entirely with the flood, the way most casual readers assume. That detail alone raises a question most sermons never touch. If the flood was meant to cleanse the earth of this corruption entirely, why does Scripture continue referencing giant bloodlines for centuries afterward? The spies sent into Canaan returned terrified, describing themselves as grasshoppers in comparison to what they witnessed there. Og, king of Bashan, is described in Deuteronomy with a bed made of iron measuring roughly 13 feet in length, a detail so specific it reads less like folklore and more like an attempt to document something the original audience would have needed convincing about. He's identified as the last remaining giant of his particular lineage, a survivor of a bloodline that conventional teaching insists should have ended entirely at the flood. And yet here he is, generations later, ruling an entire kingdom and commanding armies large enough to require direct divine intervention before Israel could stand against him. These aren't isolated mentions scattered by accident. They form a continuous thread running from Genesis through the conquest narratives, suggesting whatever happened on Mount Hermon left a mark on the world that the flood alone couldn't fully erase. This is the part of the story institutional teaching tends to skip past entirely, moving quickly from Noah's Ark to Abraham without lingering on what that gap actually contains. But the Book of Giants insists on lingering there, forcing its audience to sit with the uncomfortable reality that corruption of this magnitude doesn't simply vanish because judgment was pronounced. It leaves residue, it leaves bloodlines, it leaves questions that echo forward through generations, questions that the people compiling what would eventually become our modern Bible clearly wrestled with, given how carefully certain texts were excluded, while others addressing the same events were preserved and canonized without hesitation. Somebody, somewhere, made a decision about which parts of this story the world was allowed to keep, and which parts needed to disappear into caves and scrolls that wouldn't resurface for thousands of years, sealed away as though burying the parchment could somehow bury the truth it carried along with it. Enoch's role in this entire account goes far beyond simply recording what happened. According to the text bearing his name, the Watchers themselves, terrified of what was coming, sent a direct request through him, asking him to carry their plea for mercy before the throne of God. Think about how strange that moment actually is. Beings who had broken the boundary between heaven and earth, who had fathered monsters and unleashed corruption across the entire world, still believed there might be a path back. They didn't send an angel still in good standing to intercede. They sent a human elevated through his own righteousness to a position where he could stand somewhere between heaven and the beings who had fallen from it. The text describes Enoch sitting by the waters of Dan, reading their petition aloud, weighing every word before he even attempted to approach the throne on their behalf, as if the enormity of the task itself required a kind of preparation most of us can barely imagine undertaking. Enoch's answer, when it came, wasn't the one they were hoping for. Genesis 5:24 describes Enoch walking with God so closely that he simply wasn't anymore, taken rather than dying the way every other figure in that genealogy did. That closeness is precisely what made him the one being capable of delivering the verdict the Watchers couldn't bring themselves to accept. He tells them plainly that their request has been denied, that they will not find peace, and that judgment has already been fixed for both them and the children born from their transgression. The text describes their reaction as one of overwhelming grief, faces covered, unable to look at him directly, once they understood there was no appeal left to make. It's one of the most sobering moments in the entire Enochian tradition, a direct rejection, delivered not through fire or thunder, but through the quiet, devastating honesty of someone who once walked among them and now stood on the other side of an unbridgeable divide. What happens next to the Watchers themselves is described with a level of specificity that most casual readers never encounter. They aren't simply left to wander or fade into obscurity. According to the text, they're bound, physically restrained in darkness beneath the earth, held until a final judgment still to come, their punishment stretching across an unimaginable span of time rather than arriving swiftly the way most readers might expect. Jude 1:6 confirms this directly, describing angels reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day, language that lines up almost word for word with what the Book of Enoch describes in far greater detail. This isn't poetic imagery invented centuries later. It's a New Testament writer referencing a tradition his audience would have immediately recognized, drawing directly from the same well of knowledge preserved in these apocryphal texts. Azazel receives a particularly severe punishment within this account, one that stands apart from the fate given to the other Watchers. He's bound and cast into a specific location the text names Dudael, described as a rough and jagged place in the wilderness, and covered with darkness so that he can no longer see the light he once had access to. Sharp stones are placed over him, sealing him into that darkness with a permanence the text goes out of its way to emphasize, as though ordinary confinement wouldn't be sufficient for the scale of what he'd done. There's something deliberately symbolic in that detail. A being who once brought forbidden knowledge, forbidden illumination, is stripped of light entirely as his punishment, condemned to darkness as the direct inverse of what he attempted to give away. The text even states that the earth itself will be healed once his corruption is fully contained, as if his continued influence was actively poisoning creation the entire time he remained free to exert it. 3 Peter 2:4 echoes this same fate in condensed form, describing how God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness. A verse most readers pass over without realizing it's summarizing an entire narrative most of them have never actually read in full. The giants themselves meet an end distinct from their fathers. Where the Watchers are bound and held for later judgment, the giants are described as being destroyed outright, their physical bodies perishing in the flood, while something else, some remnant of what they were, continues on in a different form. This distinction matters more than it might first appear, because it draws a clear line between the fate of the ones who transgressed the boundary and the fate of what their transgression produced, as though the text itself is careful to separate the sin from the consequence born out of it. Certain traditions preserved alongside the Book of Enoch describe this remnant becoming what later scripture refers to as evil spirits, disembodied and roaming the earth without the physical form they once had, restless because they no longer belong fully to either realm they were born from. Neither wholly angelic nor wholly human, they wander without a body to inhabit or a home to return to, a detail that offers a startling explanation for how ancient cultures across the world came to describe malevolent spiritual entities in such strikingly similar terms, despite having no apparent contact with one another. It's a thread most modern readers never get to follow, buried under centuries of texts that were deliberately excluded from what eventually became scripture as we know it today. What makes this entire sequence so difficult for institutional religion to fully embrace isn't that it contradicts the Bible. It's that it explains the Bible, filling gaps that canonical scripture leaves open on purpose or by necessity, connecting details that otherwise float disconnected across Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the New Testament epistles. Once you see the full account, verses that once felt like strange footnotes suddenly click into place as pieces of a much larger, much more coherent story. Passages that generations of readers skimmed past without a second thought reveal themselves as direct references to a tradition their original audience understood completely, a shared body of knowledge that later readers simply lost access to as the centuries wore on, and the texts preserving it were pushed further and further outside the accepted canon. That coherence is exactly why certain communities fought so hard to keep this account circulating, even after it was excluded from the canon, and exactly why other communities fought equally hard to make sure most people never encountered it at all. Jesus himself references this entire era directly, and it's one of the most overlooked prophetic warnings in the entire New Testament. In Matthew 24:37, he tells his disciples that, "As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Most sermons treat that verse as a general statement about people being unprepared, distracted by ordinary life, eating and drinking and marrying without expecting judgment to arrive. But if you understand what the days of Noah actually contained, according to Genesis, according to Enoch, according to the Book of Giants, that comparison becomes something far more specific and far more unsettling than simple distraction. Jesus wasn't just warning about complacency. He was drawing a direct line between the corruption that preceded the flood and the corruption that would precede his own return, choosing the single most extreme example of moral and spiritual collapse in the entire Hebrew Scriptures as his point of comparison rather than any of the countless other moments of judgment scattered throughout Israel's history. That raises an uncomfortable question. If the days of Noah involved fallen beings crossing the boundary between heaven and earth, corrupting the human bloodline, and flooding the world with knowledge humanity wasn't prepared to carry responsibly, what exactly is Jesus suggesting will happen again before his return? Some scholars who take this comparison seriously argue it points toward a resurgence of the same spiritual corruption, perhaps not identical in form, but similar in pattern. Deception, blurred boundaries between what belongs to heaven and what belongs to earth, and knowledge or power handed to humanity before it has developed the wisdom to use it responsibly. Whether or not you accept that reading fully, it's difficult to dismiss the deliberate specificity of Jesus choosing that particular comparison, rather than a more generic warning about sin in general. This is where the suppression of these texts becomes impossible to ignore as simple historical accident. The early church had access to the Book of Enoch. Church fathers like Tertullian quoted it approvingly, treating it as legitimate scripture worth citing alongside the canonical texts we still read today. He even defended its authenticity directly against critics of his own era, arguing that its exclusion by some Jewish communities didn't diminish its value or its origin. It was widely respected for centuries before councils and committees, working through processes that weren't always transparent, even to the people living through them, gradually excluded it from what would become the accepted biblical canon. The Ethiopian church never made that exclusion, preserving Enoch as canonical scripture to this day, which means an entire branch of Christianity has continuously read and taught from this text, while the rest of the world was told it didn't belong in scripture at all, an inconsistency that rarely gets addressed honestly in mainstream theological education. Why would something so widely respected suddenly become unwelcome? The answer isn't simple, and honest scholars will tell you there isn't one clean explanation that covers every decision made across centuries of church councils. But one pattern does emerge consistently when you study the history closely. Texts that complicated the neat, controllable version of biblical history tended to disappear from official use, while texts that reinforced institutional authority and simplified doctrine tended to survive and flourish. The Book of Enoch complicates things. It suggests hidden knowledge, angelic corruption, and a spiritual battle far more layered and unsettling than the version most congregations were taught to accept without question. A text like that doesn't fit neatly into a sermon designed to keep people comfortable and compliant within an institutional structure. And comfort, more often than conviction, tends to shape what gets read from the pulpit and what gets quietly left on a shelf. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery in the mid-20th century changed everything about how seriously scholars had to take this tradition. Suddenly, fragments of the Book of Giants, the Book of Enoch, and Jubilees weren't just curiosities preserved by a marginalized Ethiopian church. They were found among a community that clearly held them in extremely high regard, copied and recopied alongside texts we now consider canonical scripture, treated with a level of care that suggests the community storing them at Qumran didn't view them as fringe writings at all. Multiple copies of Enoch alone were recovered from the caves, more than several books that did make it into the accepted Old Testament canon, a detail that raises real questions about how representative later canonical decisions actually were of the wider Jewish religious landscape at the time. That discovery forced a reckoning that institutional Christianity has still never fully addressed publicly, choosing instead to quietly acknowledge the historical significance of these texts while continuing to keep them out of Sunday sermons and standard biblical education. What all of this suggests is a pattern of information control that stretches back much further than most people realize, long before questions of media or institutional trust became common topics of conversation. The corruption of the pre-flood world wasn't just physical or moral. It touched knowledge itself, who was allowed to have it, who was permitted to teach it, and who ultimately decided which accounts of humanity's origin and destiny would survive into the future, and which would be buried in caves for 2,000 years, forgotten by everyone except a small remnant, determined to keep the memory intact. If Jesus really did intend his comparison to the days of Noah as a direct warning rather than a vague metaphor, then understanding what those days actually contained isn't optional curiosity anymore. It's essential context for recognizing the very pattern he told his followers to watch for, a pattern grounded not in speculation, but in a text his own audience would have known by heart. That's precisely why texts like the Book of Giants matter so much right now. In a moment where so many people sense that something beneath the surface of ordinary life doesn't quite add up, where ancient warnings about corrupted knowledge and blurred boundaries between what's human and what isn't feel less like ancient history and more like a mirror held up to the present. The suppression of these accounts for centuries doesn't erase what they contain. It only delays the moment when people finally get to encounter them for themselves and decide what to make of a history. The institutional church spent nearly 2,000 years trying to keep quiet, a history that was never actually lost, only deliberately set aside, waiting in caves and monastery libraries for the right moment to resurface and be read again with fresh eyes. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. Accounts like this one deserve more than a passing glance, and if you made it here, you already understand why. Before you go, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. There's far more buried in these ancient pages waiting to be uncovered. Like this video, drop a comment telling me which part of this account struck you the most, and stay close because another one of these hidden histories is already loading on your screen. And if these forbidden texts pulled you in the way they pulled us in, the Forbidden Book of Enoch is waiting for you in the first comment, fully illustrated, everything the institutional church left out, finally in your hands.